My mother stood up before anyone had finished eating. The room was still warm with polite laughter and the clink of silverware when her chair scraped back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The confidence in her posture did the work for her. She said my name slowly, the way people do when they're about to say something they've rehearsed in private for a long time. Then she looked around the table, making sure everyone was listening. She said she could no longer stay silent. She said she had tried to protect me. She said she had been afraid of what people would think if the truth came out from someone else first. Then she said it plainly. She accused me of embezzling company funds. She called me a liar, a thief, a betrayal to this family. She placed a thick folder on the table and slid it toward me, right through the center of the room, where every pair of eyes could follow it. The sound of cardboard against wood was louder than her voice. No one spoke. Someone stopped chewing. Someone else lowered their glass halfway to their mouth and forgot to finish the motion. I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't deny anything. I didn't ask what was in it or who had prepared it. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, my back straight, my face calm enough that it made people uncomfortable. Silence has a way of doing that. It forces everyone else to fill in the blanks. What no one in that room understood yet was that my silence wasn't confusion or guilt. It was a decision I had made long before my mother ever stood up. The air after the accusation felt brittle, like a room that had been overcooled. Forks hovered, then slowly found their way back to plates. Chairs shifted. No one met my eyes for more than a second. I could feel judgment settling in quietly, the way dust does when you stop moving. My mother stayed standing. She explained herself as if she were delivering a report. She said she had done this out of love. She said she was thinking of the family name, of our reputation, of the consequences if this kind of thing were allowed to continue unchecked. She said she had given me every opportunity to come clean. Not one person asked me if any of it was true. That part didn't surprise me. In my family, questions were only asked when the answers were already acceptable. I had learned that early. I was the youngest daughter, the one people described with careful language, quiet, intense, independent to a fault. From the outside, those words sounded harmless. Inside the family, they meant unpredictable, risky. Someone you had to keep an eye on. My mother liked stories that made sense. Clean narratives with clear causes and respectable outcomes. Children who followed plans. Careers that progressed in visible steps. Anything that moved too fast or too quietly made her uneasy. She didn't trust what she couldn't explain to her friends. When I left home years earlier, I hadn't slammed doors or announced my freedom. I packed my things, hugged everyone politely, and left. That was enough to mark me. Leaving without drama was interpreted as secrecy. Distance became evidence. So when my career didn't unfold in ways she could track, when my income rose faster than her comfort level allowed, the unease hardened into suspicion. She asked about money, never about work. She asked where it came from, never what I built. And when my answers stayed vague, as they always had, she didn't hear privacy. She heard guilt. Standing there now, with the folder between us, she spoke like someone who had finally been validated. She told the room she had hired a private investigator months ago. She said it like a confession and a victory at the same time. She talked about how difficult the decision had been, how expensive, how painful. She emphasized the sacrifice, the burden she had carried alone. I watched relatives nod along, relieved that someone else had taken control of the situation. Relief has a way of disguising cruelty. What my mother never said out loud was that she hadn't hired that investigator to learn the truth. She had hired him to prove that the story she had been telling herself was right all along, that I was the problem, that I always had been. I could feel the room shifting away from me as she spoke, people mentally reorganizing their understanding of who I was. This version made sense to them. It fit the role I had been given years ago. The quiet one, the difficult one, the one you worried about. When she finally paused, she looked at me and gestured toward the folder. She asked, almost gently, why I wasn't saying anything. If I was innocent, why wouldn't I defend myself? I didn't answer her. I knew the trap. Any explanation would sound like an excuse. Any denial would be read as panic. This wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict being delivered with witnesses present. So I stayed still. I let the silence stretch until it made people fidget. Because what my mother didn't know yet was that I had been aware of the investigation for some time. I had seen the edges of it brushing against my life in small, strange ways. Old contacts reaching out. Questions that didn't quite belong. And when I understood what was happening, I had chosen not to stop it. Not because I was afraid of what it would find, but because I trusted what it couldn't change. As my mother straightened her shoulders and announced that there was more to come, that she wasn't finished presenting the evidence, I looked down at the folder for the first time. It was thick, impressive, designed to convince. She believed it would end me. She believed this moment would finally correct the family's understanding of who I was. What she couldn't see yet was that tonight was not the end of my story. It was the moment she chose to make her version public. And once she did that, there was no going back to quiet assumptions or private doubts. The truth was already on its way. I felt the weight of the room settle on me after my mother sat back down, like a judgment that didn't need to be spoken aloud. No one said my name. No one asked a follow-up question. They just watched, waiting for something to confirm what they had already decided. I recognized the feeling immediately. I had lived inside it for most of my life. Moments like that don't come out of nowhere. They're the end result of a story that's been told over and over until it hardens into fact. In my family, I had always been the risky one. Not loud, not rebellious, just different enough to make people uncomfortable. While others were praised for being predictable, I was described as intense, withdrawn, hard to read. Those labels followed me from room to room long before I understood what they meant. My mother liked children who reflected well on her. She valued stability, routines, milestones she could point to when people asked how we were doing. When I didn't offer those markers, she filled in the blanks herself. Silence became secrecy. Independence became defiance. The less I explained myself, the more convinced she became that there was something to hide. I learned early that explaining myself never helped. When I spoke, she listened for what could be corrected, not what could be understood. Every answer invited another question, sharper than the last, until the conversation felt like an interrogation disguised as concern. Eventually, I stopped offering details altogether. It was easier to be vague than to watch my words be taken apart and rearranged into something unrecognizable. Leaving home only cemented the role I had been given. I didn't leave in a rush or a fight. I packed my things, thanked everyone for the years they'd given me, and walked out the door. That quiet exit unsettled my mother more than any argument would have. She told relatives I couldn't handle structure. She said I was sensitive. She framed my departure as a failure to adapt rather than a choice to breathe. From then on, my absence became its own kind of evidence. Anything I accomplished outside the family orbit was treated with suspicion. If I didn't share details, I was hiding something. If I shared too little, I was being evasive. There was no version of distance that didn't feel like betrayal to her. When my career began to take shape, it didn't redeem me. It made her nervous. I chose a field she didn't understand, one without the kind of job titles she could recite at dinner parties. My progress was fast, my schedule erratic, my income difficult to track. She asked how much I was making long before she asked what I actually did. Numbers mattered to her more than purpose. At first, the questions were casual, comments made in passing, then they sharpened. She started comparing timelines, asking how someone my age could afford certain things. I could hear the disbelief in her voice, the way she lingered on the word how. When my answers didn't satisfy her, she began collecting other people's opinions to fill the gaps. There was a moment when curiosity turned into certainty. I didn't recognize it at the time, but looking back, I can see it clearly. It happened at a family gathering when someone mentioned my income offhandedly, like it was a strange weather event. My mother didn't react the way she usually did. She didn't joke or deflect. She went quiet. Her expression didn't read as concern anymore. It read as calculation. After that, her question stopped sounding open-ended. She wasn't wondering if something was wrong. She was wondering how long it had been wrong. And once she reached that conclusion, everything I had ever done was reinterpreted through it. My privacy became proof. My success became motive. Other voices joined in, subtle but steady. A relative who liked to speculate, a friend who claimed to worry. None of them accused me outright, but they asked the kinds of questions that assumed the answer. My mother listened. She always listened more closely to doubt than to reassurance. By the time she hired the investigator, she wasn't searching for clarity. She was building a case. In her mind, this wasn't betrayal, it was responsibility. She was protecting the family from embarrassment. She was preventing a larger scandal. She was doing what I had forced her to do by not being more transparent. Standing in that dining room, watching her explain herself with practiced composure, I understood why she had chosen this setting. She needed witnesses. Reputation doesn't matter in private. It only exists when other people are there to see it upheld or destroyed. What she never considered was how little she actually knew about the life she was so certain she understood. She knew numbers, not systems, appearances, not processes. She saw a result and assumed corruption because she had never asked what kind of work creates invisible outcomes. I sat there quietly, listening to the story she told about me, and felt a strange sense of detachment. It was familiar. This version of me had been circulating for years. Tonight was just the first time it had been spoken out loud in such a formal way. What no one noticed was how prepared she seemed. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a presentation. The language was polished, the timing deliberate. She had rehearsed the way she would say my name, the pauses she would take, the moment she would gesture toward the folder like a final answer. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't correct a single detail. I let the room absorb the version of me she had constructed because I knew something they didn't. While my family had been busy rewriting my past, someone else had been looking very closely at my present. And that investigation didn't start where my mother thought it did. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was an email that didn't quite belong. It came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a former coworker from early in my career. The subject line was friendly, vague, just checking in. I almost deleted it without opening it, but something about the timing felt off. The message itself was casual, full of small talk, until it wasn't. Buried halfway down was a question about what I was doing these days, whether I was still in the same kind of role, and how things were going financially. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. People don't usually ask about money unless they've been prompted. I replied with a neutral answer and moved on, telling myself it was nothing. A week later, an old landlord emailed asking me to confirm dates from an apartment I'd lived in years ago. The lease had ended cleanly. We'd never had issues. There was no reason for him to double-check anything now. I answered politely, then closed my laptop and sat there, unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. Over the next few weeks, the questions kept coming. A former manager called just to catch up and steered the conversation toward my work responsibilities and compensation structure. A distant cousin I barely spoke to asked if I was still at the same company, the phrasing stiff, rehearsed. None of them asked me anything directly incriminating. None of them accused me of anything. But the questions had a shape to them, and that shape was familiar. They were building a profile. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, people circling back out of boredom or curiosity. But the frequency was wrong, the overlap too neat. I started noticing what they weren't asking. No one asked how I was. No one asked what I was proud of. They asked about access, authority, money, responsibility, and no one asked me directly. That was the detail that finally snapped everything into focus. If someone truly wanted answers, they would come to me. If they wanted confirmation, they would go around me. I felt a quiet chill settle in my chest as I realized someone was collecting a version of my life without my consent. The irony wasn't lost on me. I worked in an environment where investigations were routine, where audits and compliance checks were part of keeping systems healthy. I understood how information traveled, how narratives formed when data points were pulled out of context. I knew how easily patterns could be made to look suspicious if you wanted them to. What I hadn't accounted for was how vulnerable I would be to an investigation that wasn't about risk, but about belief. Around the same time, my company began a standard internal financial review. It was scheduled months in advance, the kind of process that happened quietly in the background. I was directly involved, reviewing controls, documenting decisions, making sure everything aligned. There was nothing unusual about it, but the overlap in timing made everything feel heavier, like two unrelated storms passing over the same place. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, reviewing reports, when a question landed in my inbox that made my hands still on the keyboard. It came from someone I barely recognized, a name from a professional network connection. The message referenced a specific internal process, one that wasn't public, and asked how oversight worked in cases like mine. Cases like mine. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't gossip or curiosity. It was an investigation, and it had crossed from vague to targeted. Someone had hired a professional. Someone was paying to have my life pulled apart and arranged into a story that made sense to them. My first instinct was to stop it. I knew I could. I could ask questions, trace the source, shut it down quietly. I had the resources and the experience. But as soon as the impulse surfaced, another thought followed close behind it. Why? I ran through the possibilities one by one. This wasn't coming from my employer. There was no motive, no trigger. It wasn't regulatory. I hadn't done anything to warrant that kind of scrutiny. It wasn't a stranger. There was nothing random about the questions. That left one option, the one I didn't want to look at directly. My family. The realization didn't come with a burst of anger. It came with a dull, familiar ache. Of course it was them. Of course it fit. I had always been the one they worried about, the one they watched more closely, the one whose success felt like a problem to be solved instead of a fact to be understood. The betrayal wasn't confirmed yet, but I could feel it taking shape. I could imagine my mother's voice, calm and righteous, explaining why this was necessary. I could hear her telling herself she was protecting everyone. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, longer than was comfortable, and then I made a decision that surprised even me. I did nothing. I didn't interfere. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't try to steer the narrative. I let the investigation continue exactly as it was. Not because I was reckless and not because I was afraid of what it would find, but because I understood something important. An investigation built on suspicion eventually runs into documentation. And documentation doesn't care who you are or what someone believes about you. It only reflects what actually exists. I trusted the records. I trusted the systems. I trusted the fact that my work, my decisions, my income, all of it, had been reviewed and approved in ways that didn't require my voice to validate them. Weeks later, I received indirect confirmation that a formal report was being assembled. The tone of the question shifted from exploratory to conclusive. Whoever was behind it believed they had enough. They were preparing to present. By then, I knew exactly what was coming. I could see the shape of the moment ahead, the public setting, the moral language, the certainty. I could imagine my mother's relief at finally having proof. Standing in the dining room now, accused in front of everyone, I understood how much effort had gone into this, how much time, how much money, how much emotional investment she had poured into being right. This was never about finding the truth. It was about ending the discomfort of not knowing how to categorize me. As I sat there listening to her speak, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The hardest part was already over. The waiting, the watching, the choice to let this play out. What she didn't know yet was that while the investigation had been busy looking for evidence of theft, it had uncovered something else entirely. And that discovery was already documented, already verified, already out of her control. The story was moving forward now, whether she was ready for it or not. The moment I understood the investigation was real, I knew I had a choice to make. I could confront my mother, ask her directly if she had gone behind my back. I could warn my family that someone was digging through my life. I could call the investigator, shut it down, force the story back into private spaces where it could be smoothed over and forgotten. Any of those options would have been easy enough. Silence wasn't instinctive. It was deliberate. I had learned long before this moment that explaining myself to my mother never produced understanding. It produced revisions. Every answer I gave became a new starting point for suspicion. If I clarified one detail, she would zoom in on another. If I provided context, she would strip it away and keep the part that unsettled her most. Conversations with her weren't exchanges. They were audits, designed to see what I would reveal under pressure. When I was younger, I believed that if I could just find the right words, she would finally see me clearly. That belief cost me years. I watched my intentions be questioned, my tone dissected, my silences weaponized. Eventually, I understood the pattern. She didn't ask questions to learn. She asked them to narrow the range of acceptable answers. So when I realized she had hired someone to look into me, I knew that speaking too soon would only help her. If I protested, it would look like panic. If I interfered, it would look like guilt. And if I tried to explain, she would hear only the parts that confirmed what she already believed. Clearing my name quickly would not protect me. It would make me look defensive. It would allow her to say I had something to hide and something to lose. The truth, inconvenient as it was, had a better chance of surviving if it arrived without my fingerprints on it. There was another reason for my silence, one I hadn't shared with anyone in my family. At the same time my mother's investigation was unfolding, I was dealing with something far more serious at work. Months earlier, I had noticed irregularities that didn't belong. Numbers that lined up too neatly, transfers that followed patterns no one could justify. I didn't panic. I documented. I escalated through the proper channels. I initiated safeguards quietly, the way you do when you understand how easily premature noise can cause damage. What I had uncovered wasn't small. It wasn't personal. It was systemic. And it required discretion. Legal processes don't care about family dynamics. They care about precision, timing, chain of custody. I knew that one careless sentence, one emotional reaction, could compromise months of careful work. The stakes weren't just my reputation. They were the livelihoods of people who trusted the systems I helped maintain. My mother saw secrecy as a moral failure. I saw restraint as responsibility. Living with that dual reality was exhausting. Family calls took on a rehearsed quality, like everyone was waiting for me to slip. Invitations came with undertones I couldn't ignore. I became hyper-aware of how often my name was spoken when I wasn't in the room. My mother's tone shifted from worried to certain, and certainty, I knew, was the most dangerous phase. She stopped asking questions entirely. She started making statements. That was when I realized she wasn't planning a conversation. She was planning a scene. She began hinting about a family gathering, emphasizing how important it was that everyone be there. She talked about timing, about not letting things drag on, about facing issues together. She used words like transparency and closure, but what she wanted was witnesses. She wanted to demonstrate that she had been right all along. I recognized the choreography immediately. In my family, public moments were how narratives were corrected. Quiet disagreements could be dismissed. Public revelations became history. There were nights when the temptation to stop it nearly won. When I sat alone, replaying old conversations, imagining how different things might have been if someone had once asked me a question without an agenda. When I wondered if silence was just another way of being complicit in my own misrepresentation. But every time I considered intervening, I came back to the same truth. This story was no longer about my feelings. It was about power, about who got to define reality when fear and pride collided. Silence, in this case, wasn't weakness, it was containment. By the time we all gathered around that table, I had already accepted how the night would unfold. I knew my mother would speak first. I knew she would frame herself as reluctant but righteous. I knew she would present the investigation as a last resort, an act of love twisted into obligation. And I knew my silence would be misread. Sitting there, accused in front of people who had watched me grow up, I felt the weight of every moment I had chosen not to explain myself. The room interpreted my stillness as confirmation. My mother seized on it eagerly, pointing to it as proof that I had no defense. What she didn't understand was that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means preparation. As she talked, as the room shifted and settled into judgment, I reminded myself why I had waited. The investigator had been looking for irregular behavior, for personal misconduct, for anything that could be shaped into a crime. What he had not been hired to do was understand systems. He had not been asked to verify processes. He had not been told to look for the work I had done to protect something larger than myself. Someone else had done that. Someone else had reviewed the same facts without fear or pride attached. Someone else had documented the truth with a level of authority my mother could not dismiss once it was in the open. So I sat there and let the silence stretch, even as it worked against me. I watched my mother's confidence grow with every second I didn't interrupt her. I listened as she spoke about evidence she believed would end the conversation. She thought the report in her folder would close this chapter. What she didn't know was that the moment she chose to make her accusations public, she lost control of how the truth would enter the room. And when it did, it would not arrive gently. By the time dessert was cleared, the room no longer felt like a family gathering. It felt arranged. The chairs had shifted subtly, people angling themselves to face the center of the table. Conversations tapered off without anyone asking them to. Even the lighting felt harsher, the overhead fixture throwing sharp lines across the polished wood. I realized then that my mother had chosen this moment carefully. Nothing about tonight was spontaneous. She stood again, smoothing her blouse as if preparing for a presentation. Her voice was steady, practiced. She thanked everyone for coming, for being patient, for caring about each other enough to face uncomfortable truths together. She spoke about responsibility, about the burden of knowing something might be wrong and choosing not to look away. Then she picked up the folder. She held it with both hands, heavy enough to look serious, official enough to command attention. She talked about the private investigator she had hired, about his experience, about how thorough the process had been. She mentioned interviews, records, timelines. She made a point of describing how difficult it had been for her to read the findings, how she had hoped, prayed even, that the report would prove her fears unfounded. No one questioned her motives. They watched her like an authority. She began outlining the accusations slowly, letting each one land. Irregular transfers, unusual access, compensation that didn't align with my role as she understood it. She avoided technical language, favoring moral terms instead. Misuse, deception, breach of trust. Each word was chosen to sound less like a question and more like a conclusion. I stayed quiet. I kept my eyes on the table, my hands still. I could feel the room recalibrating around me, people mentally distancing themselves, reassessing past interactions through a new lens. It was unsettling how quickly it happened, how eager some of them seemed to accept this version of me. My mother paused after each point, waiting for a reaction that never came. The silence worked in her favor. She filled it with her own interpretation, gesturing toward the folder as if it were a witness that couldn't be contradicted. She said she had wanted to handle this privately. She said she had given me time. She said she was forced into this position by my refusal to be honest. The narrative was airtight. Any protest from me now would sound like scrambling. The energy in the room shifted again when she reached what she clearly believed was the end. She straightened, lifted her chin, and said she could no longer protect me from the consequences of my actions. She said she was choosing the family over denial, choosing truth over loyalty. That was the moment I understood this was never about proof. It was about permission. Permission for everyone else to finally let go of the discomfort I represented. Permission to be done worrying about me. A few relatives nodded, solemn and relieved. Others avoided looking at me altogether. No one spoke up in my defense. No one asked for clarification. The verdict had been delivered, and it was easier to accept it than to question the process. My mother turned to me and commented on my silence. She asked, in a tone meant to sound gentle, why I wouldn't say anything. If I was innocent, why wouldn't I deny it? I could see the logic in her eyes, the way she believed she had cornered me. Silence to her was the final confirmation. She looked almost grateful for it. I met her gaze for the first time that evening, then looked away. Any words I offered now would be absorbed into the performance. This wasn't my stage. She took a breath, preparing to close. I could tell she was ready for the moment to settle, for the room to accept her conclusion and move on with a shared understanding of what had gone wrong. She began to thank everyone again, to frame this as painful but necessary. That was when the door opened. It wasn't dramatic. There was no slam, no raised voice. Just the soft click of the latch and the unmistakable presence of someone who hadn't been accounted for in the plan. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, heads turned. My grandmother stepped into the room. She moved slowly, deliberately, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at my mother right away. She didn't apologize for being late. She took her seat without ceremony, as if she belonged there in a way no one else quite did. In her hand was a single sheet of paper. The contrast was almost absurd. My mother stood there clutching a thick folder, pages of accusations and assumptions bound together with certainty. My grandmother held one page, unadorned, folded neatly in half. The room reacted differently to her presence. The tension shifted, not easing, but rearranging itself. Authority, I realized, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just enters and waits. My mother faltered for the first time. She looked from my grandmother to the paper, confusion flickering across her face before she masked it. She asked what this was, her voice sharper than before. My grandmother unfolded the page and placed it on the table, not in front of me, but in the center, where everyone could see it. She said nothing yet. She let the moment breathe. I watched my mother's confidence waver as she recognized the header, the formatting, the unmistakable markers of something official, something she hadn't anticipated. Two versions of the truth now existed in the same space, one built on suspicion and fear, carefully assembled to confirm a belief. The other built on verification, indifferent to belief altogether. As my grandmother lifted her eyes and prepared to speak, I felt the shift fully. Whatever happened next, the story my mother had planned to tell was no longer the only one in the room. And for the first time that night, the silence wasn't working against me. The room went still in a way that felt physical, like pressure settling into my ears. My grandmother didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for permission to speak. She simply laid the paper flat on the table and rested her hand on it, as if anchoring something that might otherwise float away. The confidence my mother had carried moments earlier drained from her face as she stared at that single page. "This is irrelevant," my mother said quickly, the edge in her voice sharper than before. "We've already reviewed everything that matters." My grandmother looked at her for a long moment, then finally spoke. She said the paper wasn't an opinion. It wasn't speculation. It was an independent legal and financial report commissioned through the company's compliance process, completed months earlier, reviewed by external auditors whose names meant nothing to my family, but everything in the real world. The word independent landed hard. My mother tried to interrupt, but my grandmother continued. She explained calmly and precisely that the report existed because my company had identified a potential internal risk and followed protocol, not because of rumors, not because of fear, because that's what responsible organizations do when something doesn't look right. The report did not begin by clearing me. It began by explaining why my financial activity had been examined in the first place. I watched my mother's hands tighten around the folder she'd brought, her knuckles whitening as she flipped pages that suddenly felt flimsy. She had expected this moment to be simple. Accusation, shame, resolution. She had not planned for context. My grandmother read aloud. She stated that my access to funds was appropriate for my role, that all transactions linked to me were authorized, documented, and reviewed, that there was no evidence of embezzlement, manipulation, or misuse. Each sentence landed with a dull finality that made denial harder to sustain. Then she turned the page. The room seemed to lean forward as one. She read that during the review, a separate pattern had been identified. Transfers that did not align with established controls. Activity that suggested a coordinated effort to divert funds in ways designed to evade casual oversight. She read that the issue had been flagged internally and escalated before it could cause significant harm. She read that I was the one who had identified it. Not accidentally, not passively. I had noticed the irregularities, documented them, initiated safeguards, and worked with compliance to contain the situation without panic or exposure. The report credited my actions with protecting the company, its employees, and its partners from a larger financial and legal fallout. No one spoke. I could feel the shift ripple through the room, the way a story collapses when the ending no longer fits. Faces that had looked certain minutes earlier now looked confused, then embarrassed. The silence returned, but it was no longer accusatory, it was recalibrating. My mother laughed, short and disbelieving. She said this was misleading. She said timing mattered. She said anyone could frame a report to make themselves look good. She asked why this information hadn't been shared with the family sooner, her voice rising as she searched for something solid to stand on. My grandmother didn't argue. She simply pointed out that the report existed regardless of whether anyone in the room wanted it to. that it had been reviewed and signed off by people whose entire job was to notice what others missed, that it wasn't created to defend me or attack anyone else. It was created to document reality. That was when it clicked for everyone else. My mother had hired someone to look for guilt. The company had looked for risk. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them had consequences. For the first time that night, my mother looked small. Not wrong exactly, but exposed. The certainty she had wrapped herself in began to fray as she realized the investigator she trusted had never been asked to look where it mattered. He had been given a narrative and told to support it. I finally spoke. My voice sounded steady, even to me. I said I hadn't hidden anything because I was guilty. I had stayed silent because the truth was already documented, reviewed, and protected by process. I said I hadn't interfered with the investigation because I trusted that facts would survive longer than accusations. I looked at my mother and told her the hardest part wasn't what she had accused me of. It was how quickly she had believed it. How easily she had accepted the idea that I would betray my work, my ethics, and myself without ever asking me a single question. The room shifted again. This time, away from her. Relatives avoided her gaze. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else stared down at their plate as if hoping to disappear into it. The performance was over, and no one knew what to do with the aftermath. I didn't smile. I didn't demand apologies. Vindication didn't feel like triumph. It felt like standing in the ruins of something that had already been fragile. My mother tried to speak again, but the words didn't land. The authority she'd relied on had evaporated. The folder in her hands was suddenly just paper. I gathered myself slowly, not in a rush to fill the space. I said that I hadn't asked for this moment. I hadn't wanted it to happen this way. But once she chose to make her accusations public, she lost the right to control how the truth arrived. No one argued. The damage was done, but it was no longer one-sided. The story had changed, and everyone in the room felt it. Some looked relieved, others looked ashamed. A few looked resentful that certainty had been taken from them. My grandmother folded the paper again and slid it back toward herself. Her part finished. She didn't look at me, but I felt the quiet steadiness of her support in the way she sat, unbothered by the tension she had just dismantled. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the reality settle. The accusations were over. The facts were on the table. But something else had broken open, something deeper than innocence or guilt. Trust, once fractured, doesn't snap back into place just because the truth is spoken. As my mother stood there, searching for words that no longer carried weight, I understood that this wasn't an ending. It was a turning point. And what came next would matter more than anything that had already been said. The room no longer belonged to her. The truth settled over the room slowly, like dust after something heavy had fallen. No one rushed to speak. No one moved to fix what had just broken. The accusations were gone, but the silence that replaced them was thicker, heavier, charged with things no one wanted to name. I sat there, cleared but not comforted, watching people avoid each other's eyes as if guilt were contagious. My mother tried to recover first. She shifted her weight, straightened her shoulders, and began to talk about fear. She said she had been scared. She said she had imagined worst-case scenarios and convinced herself they were inevitable. She said any mother would have done the same. Her language changed quickly, sliding from certainty into justification, from accusation into self-defense. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood something that made interruption unnecessary. Losing control of the story terrified her more than being wrong ever could. She wasn't apologizing. She was reframing. Around the table, reactions fragmented. A few relatives murmured soft acknowledgments, the kind people offer when they want tension to dissipate without actually addressing it. Others stared at the table, suddenly fascinated by their plates. No one challenged her. No one confronted her either. Accountability, I realized, makes people far more uncomfortable than conflict. I didn't need a public apology. What I needed couldn't be delivered in front of witnesses. When I spoke again, my voice was quiet but deliberate. I said that the investigation itself was the harm, not the suspicion, not even the accusation, but the certainty without consent. The decision to search for proof of my guilt instead of asking for the truth. I said that trust doesn't survive surveillance disguised as love. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time that night, she didn't have a ready response. I told the room that I wasn't going to argue about the past anymore. I wasn't going to relitigate every moment that led us here. I said I wasn't cutting anyone off, but I was stepping back. I would no longer explain my life to earn trust that should have existed without proof. The words landed softly, but they changed the shape of the space. Boundaries have a way of doing that. They don't ask permission. They announce themselves and wait. No one protested. Some looked relieved, as if I had spared them the effort of choosing sides. Others looked unsettled, realizing that distance doesn't always come with drama. Sometimes it arrives calmly and stays. I stood up without ceremony. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final speech. I gathered my things, nodded once toward my grandmother, and turned toward the door. My mother said my name, uncertain, stripped of authority. I didn't turn around. Outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. Relief came first, sharp and unexpected, followed closely by grief. The cost of being right made itself known all at once. Not regret, but loss. The quiet understanding that something had ended and nothing would ever return to its previous shape. My phone buzzed before I reached the car. Then again. Messages stacking up, calls I didn't answer. I didn't read any of them. I wasn't ready to re-enter the conversation now that it had shifted in my favor. Power isn't revenge. Power is choice. I went home and returned to my routines. Work, sleep. The familiar rhythm of a life that existed entirely outside that dining room. I wasn't running away. I was returning to myself. In the days that followed, the aftermath unfolded in fragments. Apologies arrived unevenly, some sincere, some strategic. My mother's messages were careful, measured, heavy with subtext. She wanted resolution without reckoning. I gave her neither. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not numb, not detached, just clear. The truth had done its work, and now it was my turn to decide what came next. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be understood by people who were more invested in their version of me than in my reality. How often I had softened my edges, minimized my achievements, stayed quiet to keep the peace. How often silence had been mistaken for permission. I understood now that silence only works when it's chosen, when it's strategic, when it protects something worth protecting. Beyond that, it becomes a slow erasure. I wasn't erasing myself anymore. My family knew the truth now. They had seen proof they couldn't dismiss, authority they couldn't override. But knowing the truth and respecting it are not the same thing. Understanding would take time, if it came at all. And for the first time, I was okay with that. I didn't need them to fully accept the version of me that existed beyond their expectations. I needed them to stop trying to rewrite it. That was the line I had finally drawn. Whether they chose to step back from it or cross it carefully was no longer my responsibility. The days after I walked away were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but steady. The kind of quiet that comes when a storm passes and leaves everything standing, just rearranged. I went back to work, back to routines that didn't require explanations or apologies. Meetings happened, deadlines mattered. My name meant something concrete again, not a rumor floating around a dining table. What surprised me was how little relief I felt about being proven right. For years, I'd imagined that moment, the instant when the truth would finally be undeniable. I thought it would feel like release. Instead, it felt like clarity. Clean, sharp, almost surgical. The truth didn't hug me. It didn't soothe old wounds. It simply stood there and exposed everything it touched. The messages came anyway. Some were awkward apologies, full of phrases like "I didn't know and I was confused." Some were softer, careful attempts to reconnect without acknowledging what had happened. A few were defensive, as if my silence after the fact was somehow crueler than the accusation itself. I read them slowly, without urgency, and responded only when it felt honest to do so. My mother was the quietest. When she did reach out, her words were measured, restrained, stripped of the certainty she'd once worn so easily. She wanted to talk, to explain herself, to reframe the situation into something less damning. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her version. I simply told her what I needed now. Space, respect, no investigations, no stories told about me without me in the room. She didn't argue with that either. Silence, I'd learned, can teach lessons that confrontation never will. Returning to my real life felt different this time. Lighter, but also more grounded. The investigation that was meant to destroy me had clarified something I'd been circling for years. Power isn't money, or authority, or even being right. Power is the ability to stay intact when someone tries to reduce you to their fear. At work, I finished what I had started. Systems stabilized. The fraud I'd uncovered was fully contained. People moved on without ever knowing how close things had come to breaking. That was how it was supposed to be. Competence doesn't need an audience. At night, though, the reflection crept in. I mourned the family I thought I had. The one where concern didn't come with surveillance, where love didn't require proof of innocence. That grief wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It sat quietly beside me, reminding me that choosing yourself always costs something. But I also felt something new settle in its place. Freedom. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind that comes when you stop auditioning for trust. When you stop shrinking your life to make other people comfortable. When you accept that being misunderstood by people committed to misunderstanding you is not a failure. I thought about how easily roles get assigned in families. The responsible one. The difficult one. The golden child. The problem. How those labels harden over time until they feel like destiny. And how terrifying it is for people when you step out of the part they wrote for you. The accusation didn't break me. It broke the illusion that I needed their approval to be whole. I didn't cut my family off. I didn't declare some dramatic ending. I simply stopped negotiating my reality. I let my life speak for itself, without subtitles, without footnotes, without permission. That choice didn't fix everything, but it fixed me. Now, when I think back to that night, I don't picture the folder or the accusation first. I picture the moment I realized I didn't have to defend myself to survive. That the truth doesn't always need your voice to arrive. Sometimes it just needs your restraint. If you're listening to this and you've ever been cast as the disappointment, the risk, the one everyone worries about while never actually asking who you are, I want you to know something. You are allowed to update the story, even if they refuse to read the new version. And if you've ever been accused, not because of what you did, but because of what someone else needed you to be, you're not alone. More people live inside those quiet injustices than we ever admit. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What role did your family assign you, and are you still living inside it, or are you starting to step out? Share in the comments. These conversations matter more than we think. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about boundaries, truth, and the quiet kind of strength that changes lives, consider subscribing. You're always welcome here. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.